On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, all systems go for China's first International Import Expo, a showcase for global free trade and a tribute to China's elderly scholars through the lens of a young photographer. The picture's worth 1,000 words.
Draw their attention on all those masters.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Over 3,000 enterprises from more than 130 countries and regions are expected to take part in the first China International Import Expo, or CIIE, from November the 5th to 10th in Shanghai. China pulled out all the stops for the CIIE, a window showing its determination to further open up its economy and to promote global free trade. Besides the usual exhibitions of commodities, what sets this expo apart is the demo for the latest technologies and talks about cutting barriers to the flow of goods. Before we start our discussion, take a look.
Work started as early as 2 weeks ago. World industry leaders are expected to bring cutting-edge high technology, with more than 100 new products expected to debut at the expo. About 400 companies have set up their high-end intelligence equipment in an exhibition area for big-ticket items like ships, industrial robots, and artificial intelligence products. The expo, announced by Chinese President Xi Jinping back in May 2017, is the first of its kind in the country, part of efforts to open up more and to support free trade and economic globalization. New Era, Shared Future, an apt theme for the inaugural event.
I think this is a very genius idea, simply because it allows both sellers and buyers to meet in one place. So in a way, people who want to export to China will be very happy to show their commodities and flash them in the Chinese market, because this is one of the fastest growing markets in the world.
Besides the enterprise and business exhibition, there will also be a country pavilion for trade and commerce and an international economic and trade forum. The expo is shaping up to be the IT event for showing China the world's biggest and brightest imports.
For more on the upcoming China International Import Expo, we are joined in our Beijing studio, Zhang Gong, a professor from the University of International Business and Economics. In New York City, Fred Tang, president of America-China Public Affairs Institute. In Washington, D.C., last but not least, Paulo von Schirach, president of the Global Policy Institute. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. This is a big move made by China, first ever import expo. Huge delegations coming from various countries attending, presenting their best goods and services. Mr. Tang, from your perspective, what kind of message is China trying to set to the rest of the world?
Well, China has been trying to move from a manufacturing and producing market to a consumer market. And, you know, in it, there's a lot of difficulties in terms of buying products from all over the world, which will take people, you know, Chinese buyers traveling. So having this expo is really a great idea to bring all of the products and services from all over the world, let the Chinese buyer to have a chance to explore, to compare, and to buy.
Professor Gong, is it just a gesture or is it for real?
Oh, of course, it's for real. I mean, we spend a lot of money trying to sponsor this exhibition, and also, you know, look at the number of orders likely to come out of this exhibition. I heard numbers something like, you know, 150,000 orders are likely to be placed from this exhibition, and look at the number of delegations from different countries, companies present at the exhibition. It's just you know, it's just a huge number.
Back in 1957, China started its first ever import-export expo, the so-called Canton Fair. And that was the very beginning of a new China interacting with the rest of the world. Of course, later there were rather political movements which hindered that process, but still reform and opening up regenerate the Canton Fair. And now we have a totally different version of it. Mr. von Schirach, to you, what kinds of opportunity does it present to the rest of the world and also to China itself?
Well, look, I think, as your other guests have indicated, this seems to me a great opportunity for China to emphasize its new, broader economic policies approaches that is turning rapidly, at least in the intention of the national leadership, from a primarily export-led economy to a consumer economy, in which the emphasis again is not going to be on the sectors that drive exports to other countries, but on the needs and interests and demands of the Chinese consumers, which is, of course, is a country, the largest country in the world.
Right.
So potentially an enormous market, 4 times the size of the United States, for that matter. And so this can be a very powerful message to rekindle, as you indicated, this tradition of creating a forum for foreign companies and entities to showcase their merchandise and their new technologies. So this can be a great opportunity.
But Mr. Tang, we have to mention this, just to be fair, that this is happening with the backdrop of the apparent trade war between China and the United States. One could say it is negotiation, way of doing things when we are saying it's a trade war, but we do see the relationship between China and the United States, 2 of the world's largest economies in the world, going downhill very quickly over the past few months alone. How should we understand this import expo itself will be able to bring both momentum for China to interact with the rest of the world and probably also opportunities to interact with the United States if the latter comes to senses?
Well, let me say first about the United States. Actually, a lot of the businesses are very, very supportive of having a good trade relationship with China, except for the current administration, and I think their position might change. I heard there's over 180 U.S. companies participating. Business leaders like Bill Gates and so forth, they're all attending this conference and they'll be speaking at this conference. The only reason a lot of the American companies are quieter is because they don't want to get the attention of our current president or getting his Twitter treatments on their company. But a lot of, in fact, tradings between United States and China have not stopped. They actually have increased. U.S. investment into China has increased. So I'm very, very optimistic in terms of, in terms of U.S.-China relations. Now, there's a saying, the White House said that there's no leaders attending this conference. Well, there's one of the very, very good reasons is that November 6th is the U.S. midterm election. And very possibly some of the House will be turned over the majority control. So everybody is very, very focusing on this. Our organization have reached out to all 50 governors, and a lot of them tell us the reason is they have to stay in the United States, not because they don't want to work with China.
Professor Gong, how should we read, with the backdrop of the China-U.S. trade war, and China is making this utmost effort to make sure this import expo will be a great success? And it will be if you look at the diversity, if you look at the efforts all participating delegations put into it. So how should we understand this? Are these 2 players moving ever more apart?
Well, let's first put things into perspective. I mean, China exported $2.4 trillion last year and imported only $1.9 trillion. So we have about $500 billion in a surplus.
Yes.
We are the world's largest trading nation. Out of that $500 billion of trade surplus, about $375 billion is with the United States. So, our biggest trade surplus problem is indeed with the United States. And this is not going to be sustainable politically as well as economically. I mean, President Donald Trump does have a point that we really need to do something about this. And I think this import exhibition, it demonstrates the Chinese government's willingness and determination to alleviate this grave issue here. And I think, there are actually several theories behind, the so-called trade war. I mean, certainly there are actually people around Donald Trump that have a deeper agenda in addition to just trying to address the trade deficit issue from a U.S. perspective.
But what we are seeing are some of the realities. On the one hand, China is having this import expo right on the day, almost, that the midterm election is taking place in the United States. Mr. von Schirach, as someone who has been a close observer of U.S. politics and certainly of this apparent trade war going on between China and the United States, the question is, are these two countries ever moving apart, or they're likely, with these momentums, moving closer? We don't know, do we?
We really don't know. And again, it can't really go either way. Mr. Trump prides himself of being an extremely skilled negotiator, which has all its strategies and ploys, some of which may be about, trying to make a big statement in order to get the attention of the other side. Let's not hide the fact that there are certain issues that cause troubles in the bilateral business and trade relationship in the United States. And they mostly go under what Americans perceive as unequal levels of market access, which is not the same thing as the trade deficit or trade surplus. And I believe these issues can be addressed constructively. I don't think that there is anything scripted here, a destiny whereby these two major countries, which have arguably, in my judgment, the most important, for better or worse, bilateral relationship in the world, that they are destined to drift away from each other. I think there is a possibility of having common ground. But again, this particular moment, and as you indicated, because of the elections, it may play to Mr. Trump's political base to appear tough, and with everybody, including, of course, China.
Mr. Tang, what you just said earlier, part of it caught really my attention. You were suggesting some of the business leaders were apparently quiet in terms of rhetoric and speaking out because they don't want special attention coming from this relatively different president. But on the other hand, communication and stating clearly the reasoning are extremely important these days. So the question is whether in the U.S. society there is a fair debate at all taking place about where trade with China should go and where trade should go with the rest of the world also.
I live in the United States. I'm spending a lot of time going to Washington, D.C., go to the different states. And I do find a fear of our president in terms of his rhetoric. And a lot of people, he had an economic advisory board and they were disbanded. I think this is the only time in history in the United States where the business sectors does not have as much of an influence on the presidency as our 200 history of the United States. President Trump is a very independent individual, and his style is unprecedented. People are a little bit worried, and people want to do good work, people want to do business, the think tanks and so forth, but they do not want to get this kind of unwanted criticisms.
I see.
So yes, this is the atmosphere that we're living in the United States.
To what extent do you think this new idea, brand new idea and brand new direction, talking about import, talking about collaboration about import, will be able to help the Chinese go one extra step, hopefully a bold and important one, in terms of countries' reform and opening up? That, I realize, is a big question, but it is a crucial question to be asked, Professor Gong.
I think this expo, in addition to alleviating our trade surplus problem, but also helps with enhancing our quality of life here. We are a society that historically has a very large portion of our GDP attributed to consumption, and our government's policy is trying to raise that level. And I think there are great products out there in many countries around the world that can have a very good market here in China. I mean, our economy is becoming more and more, in a sense, becoming more and more like a developed country. We have so many people, millions and millions of people, to go shopping outside the country. There are great products coming to China. In addition to those sort of goods from the developed world, but I think there's also a lot of opportunities for products coming from really poor developing countries. It can help alleviating poverty in those countries, especially I think in the agricultural sector, and at the same time also enhancing our own quality of life. We have exposure to some of the wonderful products around the world.
This is the Chinese version of one of the solutions, facing our world today, which is trade issue, trade imbalance, the anger in certain countries about not necessarily doing well after decades or better as they would wish. Mr. von Schirach, the question is, what about solutions from the other parties? Are other parties also making efforts in order to make solutions for all?
Well, again, probably if you ask them, they would say, absolutely we are.
Yes.
And they are trying to stress the issue of rules of the game. The perception in the West, I would say certainly in the United States, and with this president in particular now, President Trump, but I would say to some extent also in Europe, is that somehow China is trying to rewrite the rules of behavior and appropriate approach to international trade. Well, if this is wrong, if this perception is wrong, then it would be really, really important sooner rather than later in the appropriate fora, whether it's in the WTO or other multilateral fora, the G20, whatever that may be, to clarify these misunderstandings so that everybody agrees that there is one basic global trading system and that this is a formula if everybody has confidence with the rules and that the other side will always abide by the rules, I think this will go a long way in alleviating tensions. Again, China is much maligned now, and as I said, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't matter. Perception is reality because it wants to rewrite the rules in its own favor. Well, this particular event that we are witnessing now, the unfolding, would indicate the opposite, meaning we are welcoming imports. We are a major exporting nation, but we're welcoming imports, and this huge expo is an indication of our will. If we continue along these lines, perhaps more progress will be made, and hopefully constructive negotiations will take place.
We could discuss and debate about the rules of the games for a long time, because whose rules and whose games, which version of the rules, why somebody just withdraw apparently and others have to remain. So there are a lot of questions that we need to figure out about that. But before we go, we do have limited time. Mr. Chang, what about that? Other solutions, where are they?
Well, I don't think that we can really expect that much from others. I think that with this import strategy, import solution, it's really going to help China a lot, because China has a very strong export supply chain. Now it's going to develop an import supply chain. Loading the goods onto a ship is very different than loading the goods from the ship to the land and distribute it every corner of China consumers. And that will really enhance China's consumer market. Secondly is the Belt and Road Initiative is going to help the developing countries to be able to sell their goods to China. So, and also like United States and other countries. United States, when I'm looking at is everything United States willing to sell, China's been buying. We have to lift some of the export restrictions, and so China can buy more from the United States.
Whether that's likely to be the case is still a big question mark. Professor Gong, final words from you before we go.
I think from the U.S. perspective, it's actually not just about the trade deficit issue. I mean, they also complain about so-called distortionary trade practices associated with our particular
I thought you were going to talk
system.
more Chinese perspective, no?
Right. So I think this is the first step in that direction. Having addressed the imports problem, I think we also need to talk with the United States regarding those so-called distortionary trade practices, anything that we can, for example, the protection of intellectual property rights, we can do that. The state aid, we can probably scale back. SOE issue, President of the People's Bank of China, Mr. Yi Gang, already said we're willing to consider competitive neutrality. So I think all these things are, the things that we can address to help alleviate their concerns from Washington.
I don't know whether you will be the negotiator. We don't know whether that is going to be the case. But thank you so much, the three of you, gentlemen, for joining us. Zhang Gong, Fred Tang, and Paulo von Schirach. Really appreciate it, gentlemen.